This paper I present on behalf of me and Professor Pizmony-Levy. Just to introduce myself, I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the head of the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute of IGY, Israeli Gay Youth Organization. A broad consensus in the literature suggests that the school climate is of paramount importance of LGBT youth. Plus, optimal climate is perceived as a school improvement strategy that promotes a more inclusive, supportive, and safe learning environment. Scholars have operationalized key elements of school climate for LGBT youth, like homophobic remarks, peer victimization, supportive resources, and sense of safe at school. Despite the broad consensus in literature on the importance of an optimal climate for LGBT plus youth, research indicates that Israeli schools are not a safe space for LGBT plus youth. In the past decade, strides have been taken in the attempt to protect the educational rights of LGBT plus youth to attend safe and affirming schools in Israel. Thus, it is important to examine whether the experiences of LGBT students have changed. There is not a lot of data in the world, except in the US and Israel, that could allow for a school climate analysis over time. Studies in the US have pointed to general trends, such as an increase in the presence of supportive resources and a decrease in the peer victimization rate. However, these studies are not grounded in the theory of educational change. Oh, that's okay. Just a sec. So you all about that? Okay. In this paper, we seek to understand how the LGBT student experience in Israel has changed over time using the theoretical framework of educational change in schools. Literature conceptualized educational change in terms of three dimensions: the use of new materials, new teaching approaches, and the alternation of beliefs, like pedagogical assumptions and the underlining particular new policies or programs. All three aspects of change implementation are necessary because together they represent the means of achieving a particular educational goal. In this respect, changes in behavior precede rather than follow changes in belief. Three broad phases defined for educational change process within schools. Phase 1, initiation, consists of the process that leads up to and includes a decision to adopt a change. Phase 2, implementation, involves the first experiences of attempting to put an idea or reform into practice. Phase 3, institutionalization, refers to whether the change gets built in as an ongoing part of the system. Previous research led us to the following propositions. Proposition 1A, overall, LGBT students will have more access to supportive resources in their schools over the years. LGBT students will report on improvement in human-related or more school-based resources. Indicators related to change in behavior will improve at a faster rate over time than indicators related to alternation of beliefs. Proposition 2, Overall, LGBT students will report on less exposure to biased language over the years. Increase in supportive resources will have a negative effect on students' experience with verbal, physical, and sexual violence over the years. And 4, increase in supportive resources will have a positive effect on students' sense of comfort and sense of belonging over the years. Data for this analysis come from 4 waves of Israeli school climate study, a research project conducted by the authors and IGI, a professional organization dedicated to empowering LGBT plus youth within formal and informal education systems. The Israeli school climate study is based on a survey made by Glassen in the US. Survey items were adapted to better reflect the Israeli context, and additional items were adapted for more sources presented here, and some original items have been developed as well. The questionnaire is made up of these following sections. The sample consisted of total of 2,137 LGBT plus students between the ages of 13 and 18. And hereby are our findings. First, we see an increase in the number of students reporting school supports resources. We see an increase in the sense of comfort that students report talking on LGBT-related issues with school staff, especially teachers and administrators. However, we see that the level of exposure to homophobic remarks that students report does not change. We see a decline in student reporting of verbal, physical, and sexual violence that they have experienced. But we see no sufficient change in the sense of unsafe in the school that students report. We see an increase in student reports in the sense of comfort to talk about LGBT topics in the classroom and to attend a school event with a partner. Last, we see some slight improvement in the sense of belonging that students report towards their school. Using data from a survey on school climate for LGBT plus youth conducted every 4 years, we examine whether there have been changes over time from 2004 to 2016 in the experiences of LGBT students in Israeli school. We examine both indicators of hostile school climate and the availability of positive resources for LGBT plus students in their schools. In general, our findings indicate some partial improvement over the years in the Israeli school climate for LGBT plus youth. First, as indicated, we see an increase in the presence of supportive resources. Studies shows that support for the acceptance of LGBT plus students in school can contribute to creating a better climate for them. Recent research shows that LGBT plus teens were less involved in incidents of bullying when their schools implemented supportive policies. Therefore, the various improvement trends over the years, as shown, can be linked to the increase of resources, but not all the indicators examined pointed on a trend of improvement, like in the case of homophobic remarks. Frequent exposure to homophobic remarks increase the likelihood of sense of unsafe among students. As illustrated in past research, this effect of exposure to homophobic remarks holds even when there is availability of school-based resources. This effect offers us explanation why there is no sufficient change in the sense of unsafe reported by LGBT plus students in their school. However, how we provide explanation for the partial improvement and particularly to the level of exposure to homophobic remarks, which does not change over the years. Similar findings rise from US school climate analysis over time. Following theory of educational change, our findings represent only a partial implementation which associate with phase 2 of educational change process. As mentioned, implementation is the means for achieving certain outcomes. We observed some positive changes in the educational system which are not fully successful or complete. The trends of improvement which have seen related mostly to change in behavior of teachers and students, but not to alternation of beliefs. That is, the subjects of concerning LGBT in schools are still restricted only to sexual education classes and the acceptance of the other. Moreover, studies point out that the actual application in schools of these initiatives are in low rate. Relevant training programs for teachers and including LGBT content in all learning materials were given as an option assisted by limited resources and not as a mandatory or easy to apply element that has been enforced by Ministry of Education. Respectively, pedagogical assumptions underlining particular new policies or programs of the Ministry of Education did not alternate almost at all. Ultimately, the adoption of these initiatives depended primarily on motivation and ability of key change agents in schools, such as teachers, as well as influenced by all various factors of adoption of initiatives in schools. In fact, we cannot even exclusively link the rise in the presence of supportive resources to the top-down decisions of the Ministry of Education over time as presented. Changes in LGBT visibility and discourse in the Israeli society for the past 2 decades may be no less sufficient impact on educators and students in schools. Either way, it appears that there is still no full successful implementation or either institutionalization of the educational change needed for optimal climate for LGBT students in Israeli education system. In the light of these conclusions, we recommended the Ministry of Education building an implementation program for optimal school climate, which includes mandatory objectives, regulatory and evaluation modes, for example, of incorporating LGBT content in all curriculum and teacher trainings. Also, we recommend the future climate studies implementing models of educational change in their theoretical framework, and in accordance, adding indicators for the presence of resources associated with institutionalization phase. The current parameters of this presence of resources are mostly linked to support, not to the full inclusion. These parameters enable only general and sometimes binary evaluation. For example, a yes or no item in questionnaire asking, have you been exposed to positive content related to LGBT+ in school in the past year? Such item does not allow to evaluate aspects regarding institutionalized integration of LGBT issues into the school agenda, as should be for optimal school climate. And that's all. Thank you very much.